All right, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be going over our lecture on intersectionality. Let me just get this set up. There we go. All right, so we've talked a lot in the past few weeks about, you can hear, my cat is trying desperately to get into this room, so if you hear anything, just ignore it, please. Um, he's a diva. So, as I was saying, the past few weeks we've talked a lot about different forms of inequality and how inequality manifests along different kinds of social identities. But today we're going to wrap that up and sort of think about how all of what we've learned fits together a little bit more and answer some unanswered questions. Right, so some of the questions we're going to be exploring today is how does our personal biography influence how we move through the world? So not just thinking about identity as something that's a part of the structure or culture, but how does our actually biography influence our experience of the social world? And then more importantly, we're going to think about how do all of these different kinds of inequalities we've been learning about interact together? And how might we experience actually lots of different kinds of inequalities all at once? So far, we've sort of separated them out. We've looked at education inequality, health inequality, race, gender, sexuality, but how do all of these things actually fit together into one cohesive picture about ourselves? So what we're going to do today is we're going to get a little bit of background on critical race theory, which is very important for answering these questions, and look at the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who's at the forefront of critical race theory. We're going to talk a lot about intersectionality and what that means and the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. We're going to look at some case studies to sort of make all of this make sense and illuminate how these theories actually work. And then we're going to think a little bit about how intersectionality can not just be a theoretical framework, but also a practice we incorporate in our lives. There we go. All right, so part one, we're going to be focusing on critical race theory and more specifically a concept of that theory called the matrix of domination. Very dramatic name. We'll explain that a little bit more. All right, so critical race theory, as I said, is really critical for answering these questions that we've posed. And we're not just going to talk about race today, as the name of this theory kind of implies, but critical race theory is really important for understanding this perspective on inequality and social identities. So critical race theory, or CRT, as it's going to be abbreviated in the rest of the lecture, is more of a contemporary theoretical framework than some of the ones we've looked at. It originated in the 1980s, so fairly recent actually. And it developed out of what we call critical theory. And critical theory is this very big umbrella of theoretical perspectives that focus on social critiques of society and power structures within society. So Foucault, for an example, is a really good example of critical theory, as he's someone who looks at how power operates in society with the purpose of critiquing it and showing sort of what's wrong. So unlike a lot of the social theories we've talked about, critical race theory actually originates in legal studies, so in critical legal studies. So it doesn't start with social theorists per se, but with people practicing law. So critical race theory has a particular focus on white privilege and white supremacy, more specifically how that privilege and supremacy is codified into text, right? So it's codified and institutionalized in text, which then solidifies white supremacy's legitimacy, right, and also perpetuates it. So, for example, if we go down to the next part of the slide and we look at the claims of critical race theory, so they argue that white supremacy and racial power more broadly are maintained over time, not through individuals, right? So it's not the fault of individuals per se who are sort of uniquely racist, but that white supremacy is perpetuated via social structures, right? So critical race theorists look at these structures and find that we can make them visible, right, and that they can be found through textual sources. So things like legal documents, literature, film, including sort of anti-discrimination laws, so laws that have to actually do with promoting inequality, sort of where can we find white supremacy and white power within those documents. Okay, so they ask questions, for example, like what would laws look like if they were written by people of color, right? Most laws in this country, right, were written by white people. And in a way, white power has sort of been sustained through the language and how race and class and gender are codified in those places. So, because of this, critical race theorists actively seek the transformation of law and power for the purposes of racial emancipation. Okay, so it's not just that they're observing these racial inequities and this white supremacy in the documents. They do so in the purpose of removing white supremacy from it and sort of editing it so it's more equitable. All right, so you might be thinking at this point, like, all right, so like, what does that actually look like? Where, how can we find elements of racial power within legal documents, for example? So we could think about things that might seem very small and inconsequential, for example. So we could look at the gendered language within constitutions. Okay, so the use of he and him, referring to presidents and governors, for example, might seem very small, but actually illuminates these gender inequities and power structures within our society more broadly. We could also think about anti-discrimination laws, for example. So if we look at sex laws, continuing to think about gender and sex, anti-discrimination sex laws might treat women as a universal category, right? When in reality, there are lots of differences within that big umbrella category of women. Okay, so for example, I'm not going to experience the same kind of discrimination that a woman of another background might experience. So, what are the consequences of treating women as this big umbrella term, and how does that mask some of the discrimination that other women might experience? Critical race theorists also have historically looked at the Brown versus Board of Ed Supreme Court case and made critiques of that, saying that actually that Supreme Court decision was not due to the goodwill of white people trying to right their wrongs, but more so to improve our national image during the Cold War, to be on better terms with some countries who could be allies. All right, so the procedure of that case they critique as not actually being invested in racial equity, but more so advancing the cause of our country at that time. All right, so this leads us to talk more about Patricia Hill Collins. Right, so this is Patricia Hill Collins on the right. She was born in 1948. She's still alive. She's currently a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is a former American Sociological Association president, which is a big deal and tells you a little bit about how much she's respected within the sociological community. She studies feminism and gender, specifically within the African American community. Okay, so already we're starting to hint at maybe some analysis of intersectionality here. Her most well-known book is called Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the contents of that book right now. All right, so I want to specifically focus on her concept of the matrix of domination, right? And as we'll talk about in the second part of this lecture, the matrix of domination is sort of the starting point of intersectional thought. Okay, so I think before we move on to what intersectionality is, I want to focus a little bit on this matrix of domination so we can understand the foundation of it. Okay, so the book generally, Black Feminist Thought, is interested in how is power organized within a society. Okay, so not just like what power exists, but like how is it organized? How is it structured within a society? Okay. And what she argues is that if we observe this, we see these patterns of privilege and marginalization sort of emerging before our eyes along race, class, and gender lines. Okay, and we can find those patterns of privilege and marginalization within our social institutions. Okay, so we can think about like the law as a social institution, our education system as a social institution. So these big sort of not organizations per se, but these big structures within our society that we participate in. So we find those patterns in those institutions, but we also find them within communities. Okay, so neighborhoods, cities, villages, right? So we're seeing these patterns of race, class, gender, privilege, and inequities, right, in both of those places. She refers to these patterns as interlocking systems of oppression, right? So before I go on to define that a little bit more, I want to read this quotation from the book that I think is really important for helping us understand. So she writes that Black feminist thought fosters a fundamental paradigmatic shift that rejects additive approaches to oppression. Instead of starting with gender and then adding in other variables such as age, sexual orientation, race, social class, and religion, Black feminist thought sees these distinctive systems of oppression as being part of one overarching structure of domination. This expands the focus of analysis from merely describing the similarities and differences distinguishing these systems of oppression and focuses greater attention on how they interconnect. Okay. So essentially what this tells us, right, is that it's not enough to just look at each component of our identity separately, right? So it's not enough to say like, I'm a woman and I'm white and I'm straight, okay? But that actually all of these identities are part of that one overarching structure of domination, okay? So they're all part of the same system of oppression. And so with that perspective, then we need to consider all of them side by side as part of like one unit rather than just things that are separate entities that we can look at separately. Okay. So, for example, someone might say, like, my race has nothing to do with my involvement in the feminist movement, right? That my race is irrelevant. The fact that I'm a woman is the most important thing about my involvement in feminism, right? Patricia Hill Collins would say that your race has everything to do with your participation in feminism because those identities coexist under the same power structures, okay? And therefore they interlock. They actually can't be separated so much. Okay, so again, going back to that final part of this quotation is that this perspective expands from merely describing similarities and differences between people, okay, which only gets us so far. That doesn't really tell us so much about power or oppression, right? But rather, we focus greater attention on how they interconnect, all right? So how does my gender interconnect with my race? How do those two interact with each other rather than just merely coexisting side by side? Okay, so if you're still a little bit confused about what that means, that's okay. We're going to talk much more about this in the next parts of the lecture. Before you go on to part 3 of the lecture, which is the final part of this PowerPoint, make sure that you watch part 2. It's a link to a YouTube video that I think does a really good job explaining what intersectionality is and gives you some nice visual aids to think about that as well. So make sure you watch that. And then for part 3, we'll return and I'll walk you guys more through what intersectionality is and how we can use it.